Hello, and welcome back to my channel where I like to review books, recommend books, and also research them to find out the history behind them. So if you like historical fiction, nonfiction, or true crime, or you're just a nosy person like me, definitely subscribe to my channel. First, I want to talk about the book that actually got me going down this rabbit hole. The Island of Sea Women by Lisa C. This book takes place on an island called Jeju, which is just on the south tip of South Korea. This story specifically follows two girls that start out as best friends. They both become haenyos together, which I believe is how you pronounce it. And what a haenyeo is a female diver. And the women were actually the breadwinners during this time on this island. Now, unfortunately, a lot happens between their friendship, and unfortunately, they stop being friends. And this book is all about how they started off as friends and how they became enemies. Not everything is as it seems. So this book is very, very good. There's a lot of information in this. I learned a lot, and it definitely piqued my interest to research so much more about this stuff. So if you're looking for a good book to read, this one is fantastic. Now let's talk about the research that I did. I wanted to start off with the most basic information, if you will. What Jeju Island is. Like I said, it's on the southern tip of South Korea out in the ocean. It's about 40 miles east to west and about 16 miles north to south. It is the biggest island in the Korea province right now. Now, between the years of 935 all the way up until 1910, this was actually a political exile island, and it was also used for grazing horses. And it finally became a Korean province in 1946. Now I actually want to talk about the haenyos themselves. So what is a haenyeo? Like I said, it is a female diver that starts at the very, very young age. They are trained. There are 3 different levels, I guess you could say, or 3 different groups depending on your experience. Now the earliest they could find was in about the mid 1600s of when this started. However, the book insinuates that the reason why women did this versus the men was because the men, during the time of Japanese colonization, the men's labor was taxed very, very hard. So the women actually started becoming the breadwinners to bring money home, so they didn't lose a lot of money to the Japanese Empire. And I could not find anything about whether or not it always started as women or if it was eventually switched over like the book insinuates. Another theory is that women, because we have more body fat, we actually handle colder water better. Now at the very beginning, they actually wore cloth clothes to dive in. They didn't use any modern day diving equipment. They actually didn't start wearing wetsuits until the 1970s. Now they could dive as far as down as 10 meters. They would gather shellfish, kelp, other sea creatures to use to sell, to trade, or whatever. Now this group of women that would go out together, not only were they in charge of each other out in the ocean, but in life too. These women really created a sisterhood and lived, eat, and breathe with each other, for each other. It was a really tight-knit community. Now, unfortunately, the haenyos have actually declined quite a bit. At the peak, there was about 23,000 of them, and today there's roughly probably about 2,500 of them. Majority of them are over the age of 50 and have been doing this for many years, and they believe it is due to industrialization, that there were better jobs out there for a lot less risk and a lot more pay. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization actually added this to their, I guess you can say, their endangered list. This actually increased the tourism on the island. And believe it or not, in actually 2019, it was the busiest flight ever from Seoul all the way to Jeju Island. They estimate about 7 million seats were sold and about 85,000 flights happened in 2019. Now, of course, with increased tourism, there's a catch for all of it. It brought increased traffic, also brought increase of litter on the beaches and on the national parks, and it also caused water depletion. And it is actually now a tourist attraction to actually see these female divers. So if you've actually been there and seen this, definitely comment that below and what it was like to go there and see it. Now, another thing in the book that it talks about is the Jeju massacre and uprising that happened during the Japanese colonization of Jeju. So this took place right after World War II in 1948 between like March and April, and then all the way until May the following year. And after this massacre was done, about 30,000 to 60,000 people had lost their lives, which is about 10% of the population at the time. So why did this massacre happen? The Japanese had colonized the island during World War II. They were using it because it was a strategic site or an area that they needed for the war. Kind of like Midland, Pearl Harbor, they were all strategic islands that they needed because at the time warplanes could not go as far as they could today. So they needed these islands to basically hop from one place to the next in order to get to where they need to go. And what eventually ended up happening was that actually there was more Japanese soldiers than there were actually natives on the island. And roughly at the time, there was about 150,000 natives at the time when the Japanese colonization started. And of course, the soldiers had taken pretty much everything for themselves. They took their lands, they took their animals, food, everything. So majority of the natives were forced to live in poverty while this colonization was happening. Now, there is actually another book that's actually great information on as far as Japanese colonization. And if what happened on Jeju is anything that happened in China, I highly recommend reading The Rape of Nanking if you want to know more information as far as the Japanese colonization. And I have to warn you, this book is very, very hard to read. It is very graphic. It is absolutely horrible what happened. So if the Jeju natives were treated like this, I can only imagine what had happened during this time. And the natives on the island were actually known to put up quite a bit of resistance because they wanted to be independent. They didn't want anyone to rule over them. So of course, this became a problem when World War II ended and they were trying to divvy up all these different places that were basically called for by the countries that lost in the war. And because Japan had claimed the island for themselves, Jeju was one of the things that needed to be decided upon on who would run it. And of course, this led many natives to be completely upset, and rightfully so. They wanted to continue to be independent. So in 1945, when the war was coming to an end, the United Nations got together and said, okay, who are we going to give this island to? Now, majority of the people thought, let's give it to Korea. But during this time, Korea was really starting to split at the time between the North and the South. So the US had actually brought it to the United Nations for a vote on who should get it. And they voted very hard for South Korea. And this was against the Soviet Union's wishes, which the Soviet Union was really supporting the North Korea. Now, the United Nations had set up something called the United Nations Temporary Commission of Korea for people to basically go there and try to help facilitate Korean independence. However, the Soviet Union made it abundantly clear that they were not going to cooperate with this. And the reason why they were not going to cooperate is because the US had actually outlawed the Korean Communist Party. And then, of course, in South Korea, they did not want anything to do with communism. They were also very anti-socialist, and they did not want anything to do with the Soviet Union's ideologies. But then, of course, on Jeju Island, they didn't care for either side. They didn't want either one of them, nobody, to rule over them. So then they had created a political group called the Workers' Party of Korea. And these people were fighting for full independence for Korea. Now, after Japanese colonization liberation, many of the people that had left the island for whatever reason to find better work, or they were forcibly taken from the island, had actually returned back to the island after the war was over. However, there was no jobs to be had. Also, there was extreme poverty. The rice crops were not growing very well, so there was a lot of issues with that as well. So you can imagine coming from a war, all the atrocities that happened, and then now there is not a whole lot to do as far as continuing to live after the effects. So when you have all this mixed together with so many people feeling so many emotions, it was very, very easy to split the people into two completely different groups. Now, North Korea had actually come up with another political party called the Alliance for National Government. And the Soviet Union actually allowed this to exist because it had communist ideologies. Then, of course, when the US and the UN heard this, they said, oh, no, the US government was actually the only legitimate government for them, and completely disbanded the communist groups. And that's caused many, many, many people to start being angry. So on March 1st, is when things start to hit the fan. There was actually a shooting during a celebration, and the police tried to control the crowds. They used their horses, and unfortunately 6 people had died, and one of them was a child that was trampled on by police horses. And unfortunately, another 3 bodies was actually found in a river that were detainees that had shown that they had actually been tortured before they were killed and their bodies thrown into the river. And this big event is what caused 7.5 years of resistance. So on March 8th, then, many protesters had ordered the release for whoever the police had arrested on March 1st during the uprising. And unfortunately, this caused another 5 people to die. So then they had sent 400 police officers from the mainland to come to Jeju to bring it into order. And I'm sure you can guess this caused for more protests and attacks to happen. Then the US had called for a new election to appoint a ruler for South Korea. However, this still did not satisfy the protesters because they wanted a united Korea. So on April 3rd of 1948, all these fires were lit as a signal to start an uprising with about 300 to 350 rebels and about 3,000 other people. And they attacked police stations, but specifically attacked police officers that were involved in the Japanese colonization of the island. And at this time, 30 police officers were killed. The police commander had asked for a ceasefire for 72 hours to try to negotiate and figure out if everyone could come to an understanding. But unfortunately, while these negotiations were happening, another major thing happened. When all the citizens during the fighting had rushed into the mountains to take cover, when they were actually coming down from the mountains, the actual police force dressed up as the rebels and shot all these people, innocent people, but dressed up as rebels so the rebels could take the fall for it. So obviously this ended negotiations and things did not go well and things just kept getting worse. So of course they could not come to any sort of agreement, so the fighting kept continuing. So they sent in more police officers, more people joined the rebels, even the own government started joining the rebels. And actually some of the police officers did too. So the provincial government had ordered a purge of the police force for any sort of rebel sympathizers, and 3 police officers were actually executed for it. So by the time the election finally came, there was already 214 people dead. And during the week of the elections, the rebels actually had cut phone lines, cut every single telecommunication they could think of to prevent it. And a lot of the residents actually hid in the mountains, and a lot of the government officials actually did not show up to work the next day. And the turnout for the election was one of the worst in South Korean history. Shocker, I know. So the UN and the US had signed off on the election results, and they had elected a gentleman named Syngman Rhee, I believe is how you pronounce his name. And he ordered, guess what, more police officers to the island. However, majority of the police officers didn't want to hurt their own people, so there was actually a little bit of resistance from the police officers too. So in November of that year, Rhee had declared martial law on the citizens. So Rhee thought of an idea called Scorch the Earth, which was backed up by the US, and basically burn everything down, destroy everything in your wake, get rid of it. Villages were attacked, citizens were attacked, people were executed, houses were burned down, and this went on for 4 months. And at the end, only 300 rebels remained. And there were many, many other atrocities, I'm sure, that happened. Then on January 1st of 1949, the rebels had launched their final attack. However, they were counterattacked by the police and they fled to the mountains. The police then followed them up to the mountains and ended up executing everyone. So like I said at the beginning, about 30,000 to 60,000 people died during all of these riots and massacres. And about 40,000 people fled to Japan. 180 soldiers were killed and 140 police officers were also killed. 230 of 400 villages had been completely wiped out, gone, didn't exist anymore. And unfortunately, 11.9% of the people that died were children, and 21.3% of them were women. And of course, with all this uprising, massacre, unrest, this eventually led to the Korean War. North Korea had finally invaded into South Korea. And basically it was because North Korea wanted to unite Korea as one and under one ideology. This war lasted for about 3 years and it claimed the lives of millions and millions of people. Now the reason why it ended was an armistice was signed. However, there still really is no agreement that happened at the end of all of it. So technically the war is still going on because there really hasn't been a treaty or anything signed yet, or a surrender either. So now you know as much as I do about the haenyeo women and how they were the breadwinners and how risked everything for this life, and also about all the unrest during this time in the massacre, the uprising, and how it affected so many different people over so many generations. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you have any comments or any further information, definitely comment that below. If you also have any book recommendations on a similar subject, or if you have other books that you would like me to dive deeper into, definitely comment that below as well.